May I have your attention, please? This is the second tape on the Florentine School, and the two artists that we're going to cover today are Sandro Botticelli, Botticelli, and Leonardo da Vinci, D-A, capital V-I-N-C-I. Put in the first slide, please. Sandro Botticelli's dates are approximately 1444 or 45, and he lived until 1510. He was one of the most important and individual figures of the late 15th century Florentine school. His art was closely associated with the humanist culture and learning centered in the ruling circle of the Medici family. In the Uffizi Gallery in Florence today, after you pass the paintings of the early Florentine school, you enter a large room that is filled with Botticellis. The main one, or there are two main ones in this area, that are two of Botticelli's great masterpieces of his middle period. His art is divided into about three sections, those of the 1470s, those of the 1480s, then the 1490s, his final period, and very few paintings were done after 1500. With Botticelli begins the trend toward poetic and philosophical expression in art that depends on the interests of its patrons and that characterizes much of the painting of the High Renaissance after 1500. Slide, please. The other painting, the Primavera, the other one that you saw on the first slide was the Birth of Venus, are large paintings that deal with mythological subject matter in almost direct style of the Greek antiquity. In the Primavera, you not only have sort of a tapestry pattern and decoration of sort of a medieval type of art, but mainly the figures themselves are clothed in Greek clothing of the antiquity period and the wet drapery effect that was so popular in the Hellenistic Greek art. Botticelli is an offshoot of the lyrical realist Fra Filippo Lippi, who was his instructor and carried on his style very closely. Slide, please. As we look at his paintings, we will see them in chronological order. With Botticelli, line is very important. The surface is clean and smooth, but it is line that defines the figures and the forms. He created a type of grace and a beauty of face and figure so personal to him that it is instantly recognizable to anyone having the least acquaintance with Renaissance art. He places his figures, these clean, crisp-edged people, in a classical setting. It is beyond the point of any umbral quality in his Madonnas, but the Madonnas are enthroned in classical settings of almost a Baroque feeling that it's beyond the simple tale. It gets very complicated and refined. Botticelli was born in Florence sometime between March of 1444 and February of 1445. He was the son of a leather cura, and his nickname came from his eldest brother, Il Botticelli, or the Little Barrel. Slide, please. There's an elaborate refinement to Botticelli's work. As I've said, the features are well drawn, almost with a thin, delicately lined effect, and then the color smoothly blended in between these crisp edges. Slide, please. Within the three divisions of the works, in the early period, the influence is directly from Fra Filippo Lippi, his first teacher, and Verrocchio, who was also the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci. But by 1480, Botticelli had developed a completely individual style. In the mid-70s, he began to be heavily patronized by the Medici family in painted frescoes, although they are now lost, in the Palazzo Vecchio, relating to the Medici family's successful suppression of the Pazzi revolt. Slide, please. Then he goes through a series of biblical subjects, and even though they are of religious subject matter, the whole style is within the classical motif. This elaborateness of detail, this attention to drawing, to the figures that are in classical poses, the anatomy of a classic ideal. Slide, please. And all the figures assume the pose of classical antiquity, the drapery, the way it clings to the body to form the anatomy underneath. This one is of Judith. Slide, please. Another version of the same painting. We see the flow of the drapery that was popular in the late Hellenistic period, except the faces become sort of round, stylized, a personal translation of the human face by Botticelli. The background, we achieve a depth and a perspective that Leonardo never achieved. Botticelli's color scheme is quite light in value, almost pastel in shade. There's a considerable amount of light that floods his paintings. Slide, please. And then with the influence of perspective on the Renaissance artist, we see sort of an over-elaboration in the use of perspective with the Madonnas that Botticelli paints. Now we start getting an idea of the facial features that he employs again and again. But within these settings, you have the elaborate thrones and baldacchinos and settings that he places the Madonnas or the Holy Family within. Usually in one-point perspective, and the drawings are so well laid out that you can almost follow vanishing lines down to exactly the point of the vanishing point. Slide, please. Another favorite subject of the Renaissance painter was that of the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. Slide, please. This one of Mars and Venus was sort of a translation of a modern-day tale of some friends of his. We'll see some portrait panels that he did of the Medicis, especially of Giuliano, who was murdered in that year, and of Simonetta Vespucci, Giuliano's mistress, who died in 1476. The Mars and Venus of about this period, 1476, now in London, is sort of an allegory relating to these lovers. Slide, please. This is a portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici. Slide, please. And then about 1478, Botticelli painted the two large panels for which he is best known. The Birth of Venus and the Primavera, both in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. These works represent a flowering of secular humanist spirit in frank and open use of figures from classical mythology. Their subjects are free interpretations of classical and contemporary poetry popular in the Medici circle, and they were painted for a Medici villa at Castello. In this one, The Birth of Venus, you have a pure classical figure. Even though she is nude, there is no sensuous quality about her. It's almost as if she could be a cold marble statue. This painting is in beautiful color. It's on a wood panel, and although it has a crack horizontally approximately through the middle, it is still in excellent condition today, other than a few flaked areas around the bottom portion where it was wet at one time. When you see the elaborateness, the flow of the drapery, the sort of flow of the hair complementing and repeating the flow within the drapery and within the cape as Venus comes, as she rose from the sea, floating to shore, and then the person pulling the cloak around her as she arrives, being blown in by the north wind. They're beautiful little flowers that sort of sprinkle down. They could be like pink camellias or little pink roses. And the wave pattern is a very delicate little white-edged effect that ripples over a very soft, luminous green surface. Slide, please. But in the figure of the Venus, it's very definitely of a classic pose and a classic feeling, a stylized figure. Slide, please. Where there was sort of a calm to the Venus, there's an activity in the Primavera. Much is going on with the central figure sort of standing in the center as the Mother Nature figure. And you have the three graces that are straight from classical antiquity in the flowing transparent drapery. You have the god to the far left, who was the messenger, Mercury, and then you have the feeling of Spring herself that is depicted as a flower garlanded, very elaborately dressed figure, sort of middle right. These works represent a free interpretation of classical and contemporary poetry that was popular at this time in Florence. Among the most lyrical and poetic works to come out of the Renaissance, they sum up Botticelli's early development and in the graceful, slightly melancholy figures in which detailed anatomy is sacrificed for smooth, linear elegance, in their unreal and tapestry-like flower-studded setting, and in their youthful, sensuous exuberance. Slide, please. This is a detail of the portion, and you almost have sort of a throne effect with the silhouetted leaf patterns that sprinkle around the background behind the figure of Mother Nature. Slide, please. And I think one of the most delightful areas of any painting, the figure of Spring, with the beautiful little flowers almost like woven into a tapestry, and it extends, although you can't see it in this slide, into a beautifully patterned material in her dress. Slide, please. Then there's a large area of the middle period in the 1870s where he does many religious themes. This one, Madonna enthroned with saints. He used many of the Medici family as portraits within this arrangement, and others too that were recognizable at the time. Notice how strong the perspective lines in the floor that lead up directly to the vanishing point in the little throne that the Madonna is sitting on. Also the vanishing points of the fairly elaborate classical architecture. The crowding of the figures, you see St. John and St. George over on the right-hand side, and other religious figures scattered around. It's a typical Botticelli Madonna's face in a very elaborate, elegant setting. Slide, please. He did some frescoes in the Sistine Chapel for the Medici family during this period. And as in all fresco work, you have a tendency to lose the crispness and cleanness of an oil panel. Slide, please. This is also from one of the frescoes. Notice how they were intrigued with the use of perspective. It gives great distance. Now this is early part of 15th century, where you still have a fairly monumental classical effect with the use of the pyramidal composition, the use of one-point perspective that draws your eye into a great vast distance into the background. Slide, please. In one from the Sistine Chapel, the finding of Moses, this is a detail. Slide, please. And another detail. Da Vinci did have the round face, but Botticelli seems to have a more oval face, and especially with the use of the higher colors. Slide, please. And this certainly has left the simplicity of the setting in Nazareth, of the adoration of the Magi, when it's included within the sort of ruins of this classical building. The building at this point was based on classical antiquity, except all of the Renaissance buildings then become Renaissance. The use, the superimposed classical motifs on Renaissance buildings. Slide, please. Portrait of a youth. Notice in the treatment of the eyes how cleanly drawn they are. And almost alongside the edge of the nose, there's a line that defines the form. His paint has a more opaque quality. With Da Vinci, you have sort of a transparent quality. Slide, please. And another portrait dating of the same period. Slide, please. He painted several tondos. The tondo means a circular painting. And this one's called Madonna of the Magnificat. Slide, please. And a detail of the head. Again, there was great attention to the hairdo, the folds, the drapery. It's almost a rope-like effect, where things become sort of twisting and turning. Slide, please. Another one of the Madonna paintings. But you see the decorative quality that he goes to, the elaborateness of the background, the sort of tapestry effect of all the details. Space is filled and well used. Although with the use of perspective, even though this is one-point perspective, which sort of lines things up across the bottom of the painting, he achieves a great space, depth to his work. And we have a detail of this. Slide. Slide, please. Another tondo. Slide, please. Toward the latter part of his career, his style seemed to flatten out, and although there is movement within the figures, they seem pasted on a very still background, much the same way as Da Vinci's Last Supper will show sort of a transition between the more static early 15th century and the movement that's achieved in the paintings in the latter part of the 15th century. Slide, please. Also during this part of his career, the colors seem to be more blended, more flatly applied, a smoother surface. Slide, please. He did several of these of the Lamentations of Christ. Slide, please. He was a great follower in Florence of the fanatic religious Savonarola that was finally martyred at the stake. But during this period, he was greatly under the influence and teachings of this man. Slide, please. And some of his last paintings were gigantic, monumental compositions where the figure gets smaller in scale of the surrounding areas. Even more classical in its approach of the massive buildings encircling the people. Slide, please. And in this one, which is a great allegory to the virtues and the vices, centered around this great activity, we have the different vices of the figure, the judge enthroned, being heavily taken over by guile and deceit, the two figures, and then the next two figures moving from the right over would be folly and suspicion, and envy is sort of dragging the victim that is pulled across the floor. And then you have repentance that is sort of asking forgiveness. And then truth in the far left is the nude figure, sort of oblivious to all the activity that's going on in the rest of the composition. But you can see how elaborate they would go to direct their compositions to some meaning. Slide, please. His later works are very austere, such as the Madonna enthroned, again the nativity scene with the angel sort of floating around the top, and they become almost abstract as after Savonarola's death that he lost sight of his religious direction or spiritual direction, and they display sort of an excited nervousness, quite at variance with the relaxed grace of his earlier work. Slide, please. These last few, this one, Agony in the Garden, was painted in 1501, but really after about 1500, Botticelli painted very little. The second artist that we're going to look at today, Leonardo da Vinci, V-A-V-I-N-C-I. So, the second artist that we're going to look at today is Leonardo da Vinci, V-A-V-I-N-C-I. His dates were 1452 to 1519. The slide that's on the screen now is actually attributed to Da Vinci's master, Verrocchio. He worked in the studio of Verrocchio and surpassed his master at a very early age. But it is known that as most of the apprentices began by grinding paint and then by applying cartoons to walls for frescoes and then maybe laying in background colors for the master to finish, and then finally, at the last of their apprenticeship, being allowed to do some of the lesser details in the painting. We're not familiar with this sort of rumpled muscle structure in a Da Vinci. We see a much more smooth quality, but can you guess what area of the painting is attributed to Da Vinci? The two angels, though, are on the far left of the painting, are believed to have been done by the student of Verrocchio, Leonardo da Vinci. Slide, please. In looking at them closely, it does not show the refinement that we expect in the later date Da Vinci's work. He's still under the master's scheme here, but the attitudes of the figures, the beautiful handling of the modeling of the hands and the angel in the far in the back, and then the twist of the head, the eyes, the skin seem to be a little more puffy than the stylized representations that we expect in Da Vinci's later work. Certainly the curly hair and the attention to detail and the drape structure of the angels are very similar to drapery sketches that we find in Leonardo's work. Slide, please. Leonardo is a fascinating artist, a genius approximately 400 years ahead of his time. And to the art historian, it's a little disconcerting that art was only one of his minor passions. He was a brilliant man who wrote discourses on the humanities, on optics, every subject that was available. He was the true idolization of the Renaissance man, the curious intellectual, the intellectual curiosity of the man, the search, finding information, discovering things. And painting to him was a visual means of putting down these scientific theories. This is an early painting, and it is based on the golden mean, the perfect proportion developed by the Greeks, of where the buildings are divided, the composition is divided, the figures are placed according to a scientific formula so that the areas would be divided in the most interesting and pleasing manner. But even within this, we see the early Da Vinci's work influenced by the traditions of early 15th century work. The one-point perspective, which allowed for a very static but a monumental composition. The feeling of grandeur, the feeling of space, especially going back to that one point of infinity that you find located just over the garden wall out in that far distance of that fantasy background that Da Vinci put in many of his paintings. The two figures form somewhat of a pyramidal group based on the triangle, and almost into two triangles where the angel itself forms a triangle, the Virgin forms another triangle with the pretty little Renaissance chest with the shell decorations and the garland motifs decorated on the front side. Everything is lined up parallel to the picture plane. And then all of the buildings divided. The rustification on the edge of the building forms one vertical division of the golden mean. The garden wall forms a horizontal division of the golden mean. And the placement of the figures, you will find that he absolutely regulated the composition of this according to his own wishes. Nothing was accidental in the painting. Slide, please. It is an early effect. The work is a little bit tighter. You don't have that sort of hazy atmosphere that you find in later Da Vinci's. And certainly the background seems much lighter than we would expect in a Da Vinci painting. The faces are already becoming stylized and smooth, that beautiful brushwork and blending of tones that he achieved in his work. Slide, please. He did many Madonnas, although very few have a true lineage. Most of them are endowed. In fact, of all the Da Vinci's, there are only about 5 that are absolutely authenticated where their lineage has not been broken since the date of their production. Most of them they're quite sure that they are Da Vinci by technique and by the X-ray process and placing it in the right time. Slide, please. With Da Vinci, most of his works were established by a chiaroscuro. After many sketches, formalizing the ideas and the compositions, he would then begin on his panel, the wooden panel, and it would be drawn in first. As Da Vinci said, drawing is the means of the Renaissance artist. Color is only a decorative addition. And then, in a painstaking process of building up soft tones, transparent tones in this chiaroscuro, which means a completion of values, more or less, the drawing in paint, of thin washes of paint, establishing your dark and light areas. Slide, please. Another one in chiaroscuro that absolutely satisfied Da Vinci to the point that he did not feel it necessary to even add the color is the great painting of the Annunciation that's at the Uffizi in Florence. It's a fairly large painting, about 4 or 5 feet square, and it is also based on the pyramidal or the triangular composition. The main composition you see from the wise men up through the upper point of the triangle with the Madonna, forms the basic triangular pyramid in the lower portion of the composition. Then he does introduce some activity in the horses in the background and the architecture. It all seems a little divided, but he felt that this would then express the distance that he wanted to achieve behind this solid blocking group of figures. It is noted that in many of his sketches, he would sketch all the figures in nude first and then apply the clothes on top of them. Slide, please. Slide, please. One of the most favorable of Da Vinci's paintings is in the Louvre, and it is called the Madonna of the Rocks, so named at a later date because of the rock formations in the background. It was commissioned in Florence, most likely by the city of Florence, because it is the blessing of St. John that the Christ child is giving to the figure of St. John. The angel is pointing toward the figure to emphasize its importance, and St. John was the patron saint of the city of Florence. He uses these marvelous, dark, rich tones, again, the triangular or pyramidal composition. And then in the background, where the frontal plane of the figures all of a sudden jumps to these craggy, mystic rocks that sort of produces an infinite range of a universal effect in the background. No certain place, no certain time. It was a universal feeling. Slide, please. In the group with the Christ child bestowing the blessing, the beautiful hand of the Virgin foreshortened. Slide, please.